Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. And I've got a real treat for you in this next lecture. This lecturer, John Simon, has gone to his reward. He's been passed now for, probably 20 years. But his legacy is profound. Back in the 1960s, in the centennial of the Civil War, two great archival projects were undertaken. One Northern Papers project and one Southern Papers project. The Northern Papers project, Southern Papers project were the papers of Jefferson Davis, which now after nearly 60 years are complete and span, I think, 13 or 14 volumes, which I have in the BGES library. They were based at Rice University in Texas, and they provided sources of funding. Probably, I would dare say, probably the project produced 25 or 30 million dollars in funding over the long-term range of assembling all the papers and editing and selecting the various papers of Jefferson Davis. The second great project was the papers of the victor, U.S. Grant. And while there were other people of interest, Grant, of course, had gone on to be the president of the United States. And so a determination of Grant as a really, truly great person, perhaps our greatest general, and his presidency and the ups and downs of that certainly seemed to be grist for a very substantial long-term archival project. And so the papers of U.S. Grant were undertaken, and they would take also some 50 plus years to get done, and they would be placed at Southern Illinois University, I believe in Carbondale, Illinois. And the person who was selected to do this was the archivist, Dr. John Simon. Simon spent his entire career at Southern Illinois, and because of the monies that came in with the various and sundry grants, he never gave this up. He was the editor of the project, and so he brought a lot of people in. It was funded and so forth. But unlike the Davis papers, which saw 4 or 5 editors during the life of the project, Simon was almost the exclusive editor of the U.S. Grant Papers project. And so he became a really powerful man. Whenever people wanted to talk about Grant, he would travel with his delightful wife, Harriet, and they would come around, and he would present and harump and share some of the incomparable knowledge of all the different papers and where they were and what they did relative to Grant and the subject that he was going to address. And so in talking about Grant, this great Battle of Shiloh, which truly could have been the end of Grant. I mean, he had had some smashing successes early in the year, and then had run afoul of his boss, Henry Halleck, who grew jealous of his successes and shelved him for disobedience of orders, only to be compelled by the Lincoln administration to restore Grant to command just before what would be the Battle of Shiloh. Of course, at the same time, William Tecumseh Sherman had just been restored to command after having been deemed to be insane for suggesting in Kentucky that it might take an army of 150,000 or 200,000 people to put down the Confederate rebellion, that in a state which was officially neutral at the time. People thought Sherman was nuts. Well, in Grant's case, they thought he was drunk and a drunkard. And so both had a great deal of luggage to carry with them. But nonetheless, they formed a team that would ultimately prove to be the victors of the war. And to my way of thinking, Grant is certainly one of the top 2 or 3 greatest generals in all United States military history. George Washington and George Marshall being the other two that are at the top of my list. So John is a gruff, harumph kind of a guy who sticks close to a podium, and at this stage in his career, he's much older. He'll be dead in a few years, as will his wife. His papers project, when the funding dried out, John's act grew old after a while, and Southern Illinois didn't want to give them the space and the recognition that John's 50 plus years had earned, and so John pulled the papers project away from Southern Illinois with all the books that he had written and everything relative to it, and looked around, and his good friend John Marszalek at Mississippi State in Starkville said, "I'll take it," because John had just written the biography on William Tecumseh Sherman, and U.S. Grant invaded the South once again, and his papers and his the U.S. Grant Papers Project remains now in Starkville, Mississippi, at Mississippi State University, under the supervision of the Professor Emeritus of History, Professor John Marszalek. So sit back, relax, and enjoy John Simon and his presentation on Union leadership at Shiloh. Of U.S. Grant, in which is obviously the most oft quoted and cited source of any types of work on Grant. He is also the founder, past president of the U.S. Grant Association, still a member of the board, and is a the mentor of a number of scholars that are in the Civil War field today, most notably our second speaker, Steve Woodworth, who had him as a student several years ago. I've been working for some time with John, and I'm delighted that we've finally been able to deconflict our schedules and get him on the program. So would you please join me in welcoming John Simon?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here, and a special treat to talk about the Battle of Shiloh, one of the key battles of the Civil War, and one of endless fascination. What I'd like to do today is begin with the Fort Donelson, which happened on February 16th in 1862. It was a key Confederate emplacement on the Cumberland River. It was the center of the Confederate line through Kentucky that went from Columbus in Kentucky over to Bowling Green, dipping into Tennessee at the point of the forts at Henry and Donelson, forts that were constructed while Kentucky maintained its neutrality. It was difficult for Grant to get permission to attack Fort Henry. He had to argue with General Halleck for permission. Then after he took it, he advanced on Fort Donelson, which Halleck did not give permission for Grant to do, and Halleck took no official cognizance of the advance on Fort Donelson because Halleck was a military bureaucrat par excellence, which meant that if Grant was successful, Halleck was ready to claim all the credit, and if Grant failed, he'd say, "I knew nothing about it." Grant had a confidence in himself and in his army that led him to advance from Fort Henry on the Tennessee over to the Cumberland, using two roads, thinking that the Confederates would not advance and attack, that they were themselves somewhat conflicted over their mission at Fort Donelson, and Grant's expectation was met. He then besieged the fort with an army that was inferior in numbers, waiting for more troops to come up. He was the victim of a Confederate breakout on February 14th, or 2 days before the fort surrendered, in which General Pillow led a sally from the fort that actually rolled up the Union lines and opened the road to Nashville if Pillow had chosen to use it. At that point, Pillow retreated into Fort Donelson to consider his options, and while he was considering, Grant closed the gap and he had no options left. This led to the first major Union victory of the war, the capture of something like 15,000 Confederate troops, a number still in dispute, and troops were still arriving after Fort Donelson had fallen, as Confederate troops were still arriving. Now, this led to the fall of Nashville. It led to Halleck's enormous jealousy of Grant, who was younger and inferior in rank and was getting all the credit for the capture of Fort Donelson. It was important to Halleck to get credit not only bestowed upon himself, but to get promotions for other officers, and in particular, General Charles F. Smith, who was Grant's subordinate at the capture of Fort Donelson. Smith was the kind of officer that Halleck liked. He was older, he was experienced, he had been commandant of cadets when Grant had been a cadet, and as far as thinking that Smith was a better general, more in appearance like a general, Grant agreed with everybody else. Consequently, immediately after the fall of Fort Donelson, Grant became a national hero. The initials of his name matched the demand for unconditional surrender, which was trumpeted throughout the North, and Halleck decided that he was going to crack down on Grant. He sent a flurry of charges to Washington, including one that Grant didn't know about at the time, that Grant had resumed his former habits. Unlike modern leaders, this did not mean chasing women. It didn't mean sleeping late in the morning. It didn't mean anything except to an old Army officer that Grant was probably drinking again, and Halleck had no reason to send that charge to General McClellan. McClellan responded that if the good of the service required it, put Grant under arrest. It was something that even Halleck would not do. But he did replace Grant in command of his own army with Smith, who was sent to Pittsburgh Landing, and Grant was to remain behind at Fort Henry. From there, he sent a flurry of objections to Halleck, which amounted to a demand that Halleck should either put up, that is, sustain his charges, or abandon these charges. In the meantime, the capture of these two forts was an important blow to the Confederacy. And Union gunboats were able to ascend the Tennessee River, which was the more important of the two, at least in immediate terms, as far as Muscle Shoals in Alabama. It was very important to get those gunboats on the Tennessee River. And I'm pleased to announce that in the county adjoining this, Tishomingo County, which is a beautiful name, there were a lot of Unionists who went down to the riverbanks to salute the Union gunboats. There they were, the residents of Mississippi, standing on the bank saying, "I see the stars and stripes coming down the river. Isn't that a beautiful sight?" It's important to remember that while we normally think of the Confederacy as demarcated by state lines, and with Confederate sentiment getting stronger as we move south, and particularly into Mississippi, there are a number of Mississippi Unionists, and this is part of the reason for the advance into the South. That is, there is a belief that there are a number of people who need some sort of liberation. Now, on the other side of the Fort Donelson question is, of course, General Albert Sidney Johnston. The most respected general in Confederate Field Command. That is, here was a commander who had led the 2nd U.S. Cavalry as its colonel. The lieutenant colonel, that is his subordinate, is Robert E. Lee. Jefferson Davis said of Johnston, if he's not a general, then we better give up the war, for we have no general. If there's anybody who admires Albert Sidney Johnston, it is Jefferson Davis. Johnston had come to the Confederate capital at Richmond at a time when Davis was lying upstairs ill. Davis is reported to have said, Albert Sidney Johnston is here, I recognize his footsteps. We're not quite sure what his footsteps sounded like. How could Davis know them? One of my students once suggested that Johnston was too dumb to get off his horse, and that's what Davis heard upstairs. We're not sure about that. Although Johnston had been the pride of the Confederacy, we noticed that he had commanded during the Mormon War. Anybody remember the Mormon War? It was a war that was easily forgotten. And as Albert Sidney Johnston approached to teach the Mormons a lesson, was there a scene where Brigham Young was throwing wives out the window? I'm so afraid of Albert Sidney Johnston? No, he kept every wife inside the house, and then eventually Johnston went back. Now, Johnston is in part responsible for the fall of Fort Donelson. Part of the problem there is a tentative approach to the defense of that fort. Should it be held to the last man, or was it an exposed position which should have been evacuated? Albert Sidney Johnston had taken the middle ground on that. He hadn't reinforced it, he hadn't withdrawn the forces. Pillow was confused about whether he should leave or stay, but he simply reflected the confusion that his superior officer had engendered. When Fort Donelson fell, then the Confederate line in the west cracked, and the Confederates withdrew as far away as Corinth. Corinth, because it was an important railroad intersection where the Memphis and Charleston met the Mobile and Ohio. It was a place at which Confederates could be conveniently assembled and which they were to defend because of the vital importance of this Memphis and Charleston line. That is, a line connecting both parts of the Confederacy from the Mississippi River over to the Atlantic Ocean. Albert Sidney Johnston, of course, continued in command. His second in command was Beauregard. His corps commanders were Bragg, Hardee, Pope, and Breckinridge. And notice that one of those corps commanders is Hardee, which is the way he pronounced his name, which is the way everybody else ought to pronounce that name. And if you stop for a hamburger someday, and you happen to stop at a place named, we think, in honor of General Hardee, pay no attention to the TV ads for Hardee's. It is not Hardee's, it is Hardee's, just as in the general's name. At any rate, these are the corps commanders, and remember at least Hardee when you stop at one of his famous restaurants for a burger. All right, so here we have a Confederate force at Corinth, and the Union is going to attack. There is every expectation that the troops that have been sent up the Tennessee River and that have been landed, most of them at Pittsburgh Landing, which is the most convenient point on the river for reaching Corinth. It's about 22 miles away. These troops are going to advance on Corinth. They are not going to advance simply as the army that Grant had commanded. They are instead to be joined by the forces under Don Carlos Buell that had been ordered to support this attack. This is going to be a joint attack, and Grant was restored to command of this army after Smith got into a boat, managed to scrape his leg, infection set in. Smith was incapacitated, while Halleck still had his eye on General Charles F. Smith as the best man to command the Union armies. Grant had to resume command because Smith was out of action. The idea was that the forces at Pittsburgh Landing, first of all, would be consolidated. Part of Grant's force was at Crump's Landing because of the inadequate facilities at Pittsburgh Landing, and the army under Buell that was marching overland would join them at Pittsburgh Landing for a joint attack on Corinth. The force at Pittsburgh Landing was commanded by General Sherman. Sherman, who had been rehabilitated under Halleck's watchful eye when he had apparently suffered a nervous breakdown when in command in Kentucky. As for nervousness, this is characteristic of Sherman. He is essentially assembling troops for the march on Corinth. He has a relatively secure position as he sees it, with his flanks protected by Owl Creek and by Lick Creek as well. And because Grant is overall commander and is coordinating the operations against Corinth, he is just before the battle at Savannah, upriver, some 9 miles, awaiting Buell. He's going to discuss with Buell how to get these two armies together for the attack on Corinth. Now, because everybody's attention was focused upon this operation of two armies against Corinth, there was little concern about what the Confederates were doing or might be doing, and of course, this is the fatal element in the onset of the Battle of Shiloh. Grant did not expect an attack. Sherman, who was on the scene, was even less expectant of anything. And Halleck had warned against any operations against the enemy before Buell got there. Halleck is nothing if not cautious and does not want any prior commitment of U.S. troops until both armies have assembled. Now, meanwhile, in Corinth, Albert Sidney Johnston sees that this is the moment for the Confederates to do something. If Confederates await this attack in Corinth, they will be faced by overwhelming forces. They're bound to be defeated, that is, by the combined numbers of two armies, and there's nothing more sensible than moving out from Corinth and attacking Grant's army before Buell can get there. Johnston makes this decision on April the 2nd. He orders his men to advance the very next morning. Now, the story of the Battle of Shiloh is that one of the decisive elements of the Battle of Shiloh is Johnston waited too long. He should have moved out immediately. Once he's decided to attack, the time to attack is absolutely right now. There's nothing to be gained by any delay whatsoever, but the Confederates were hampered by rain on April 4th and 5th, and still they are moving out, and they are moving toward Shiloh, and there are skirmishes on those days that should have alerted the U.S. troops. It's on the occasion of one of these skirmishes that Sherman says to one of his colonels, Jesse Appler, "Take your damn regiment back to Ohio. There are no Confederates closer than Corinth." It's Sherman at his best, and and Sherman at its worst. There's just no distinction between the two. He is so positive about everything. He always knows what's right. If he says there aren't any Confederates out there, then there aren't any. Who in the world had his troops been skirmishing with? Well, it doesn't bother him in the least. Sherman has an answer for everything and for everybody. And later on, when somebody asks him, what's Grant's middle name? Sherman says, I've known him since he was a cadet. His middle name is Sidney. It's not right. It's a Sherman-type answer. He was U.S. Grant, and if Sherman thought his middle name was Sidney, then by God, that's what it was. It was. All right. So we have not only the U.S. Army ready for an advance on corn, but we have a U.S. Army that's not prepared for an attack. And Johnston orders an attack at daylight, saying, I would fight them if they were 1,000,000. That's Albert Sidney for you. No, it's not a good idea to attack 1,000,000 men, but Albert Sidney is given to language of that sort. And we'll also say that we'll water our horses in the Tennessee this evening, when he wasn't going to go to the Tennessee at all, knowing that the U.S. had gunboat support there. It's a strange battle and a peculiar battle in the sense that the Confederate Corps are behind each other. That is, they're not in a line of battle with the different corps occupying different segments of the battle line, but they are one behind the other. Partly a function of the narrow roads, but partly a function of poor planning at that point. One of the ironies of the Battle of Shiloh is that it was opened by a Union attack. That is, one of the Union regiments under Peabody actually opened the battle by attacking some Confederate skirmishers, and the other supreme irony is that the attack comes at Shiloh Church. Shiloh is a derivative of the Hebrew word for peace. It is related to the term shalom, with which Israelis greet each other. And of all the places where this battle opened, Shiloh is the most ironic. It is, despite the fact that the Confederates have been in the neighborhood for some time, generally seen as a surprise. Certainly it comes as a big surprise to General Sherman. Unprepared for the battle, criticized later by people who said that his men were sleeping in their tents, were bayoneted while sleeping. Sherman said if they were still sleeping, then they should have been bayoneted. Sherman has absolutely no mercy for his own men or for anybody else. It is an initial Confederate success for a couple of reasons. One, the Union unpreparedness, and secondly, the fact that there really are more Confederates on the field, probably 45,000 of them, to, at most, the 40,000 that Grant can muster. Grant was drinking coffee, apparently, in the morning when he heard these guns, and put that coffee cup down, probably without spilling, but we're not certain about that, knowing that he had made that terrible mistake. That is, that he was thinking in terms of the battle that he wanted to begin, the campaign he wanted to wage, and not thinking about what the Confederates might do. The coffee cup went down. Grant started toward the battlefield. He sent orders, verbal orders, to Lew Wallace, who was at Crump's Landing, whereupon Lew Wallace immediately started marching to the wrong direction. Wallace, who is, after all, that same who created Ben-Hur, was even more creative in explaining his march on the first day at Shiloh. I had a plan. If he had been Nixon, he would have called it a secret plan. I'm going to come in on the Confederate rear. No, that's the way he told me to march. It went on and on over the years, as long as Lew Wallace lived. And the result was, of course, that having started off in the wrong direction, Wallace never arrived there on the first day of battle. The initial Confederate attack was a success. That is, several of the Union camps were overrun, and the men began to run, and they began to run to the river, to the Tennessee River, to Pittsburgh Landing, where there were many men who were roughly cowering on the banks of the river, hoping for some sort of relief or rescue, perhaps, by the gunboats, not with a sensible plan at all. Certainly, it is significant that Grant arrived on the field about 9 in the morning, and he began to stabilize his line. He'd already ordered Wallace forward, though unsuccessfully, and he began to coordinate with the advance of Buell's army under General Nelson, which already was in the neighborhood. In the meantime, the Confederate success on the field had been followed by disorder because of the faulty alignment of Confederate troops as the battle began. The commanders on the field did not have control over their forces, and in addition to organizational disarray, there was some looting of the Union camps. Some of the troops did not see their mission as moving ahead. But on the field of Shiloh, time was of the essence. If the Confederates could not push their advantage speedily, if they could not drive Grant's army into the original trap that they planned at Owl Creek, then this army would be reinforced by Buell's men. And of course, they knew nothing about Wallace's troops being away from the field. So there is a problem in coordinating the Confederate attack, in getting it to move as aggressively as it should. And part of it is misdirected. Part of it is misdirected at the defense that General Prentiss has set up, and not devoted to moving around it. In the midst of the battle, Albert Sidney Johnston was seen to reel in his saddle, and one of his officers said, "General, you appear to be wounded." "Yes," said Sidney Johnston, "and I fear seriously." A dumb thing to say. Should have said, "In the leg, in the leg." Instead, they took him off his horse, examined his chest, they looked all over, they never found where the wound was, and while they were looking for the wound, Albert Sidney Johnston bled to death. This puts command in the hands of Beauregard, who had, in effect, been the commander before. Because of Johnston's rather ambivalent feelings about the attack, his unwillingness to take total responsibility, it was Beauregard who had made up the plan for the advance on Shiloh, and the difference is not dramatic in terms of Confederate command, but it is dramatic in terms of Confederate morale. Sidney Johnston had been much admired by the troops, and the word of his death is a significant blow. He died about 2:45 in the afternoon. By late afternoon, those Union troops that had been holding out in the Hornets' Nest were about to surrender. About 5:30 in the afternoon, some 2,250 men are captured at the Hornets' Nest, and then the Union Army is driven back to the final defense line. The one that you'll see so clearly marked on the battleground at Shiloh, essentially the line marked by the artillery under Joseph D. Webster, and at that point many of Nelson's troops had arrived. Should the Confederates have pushed the attack on the first day? Well, there are a lot of Confederates who think so. That is, people at the time thought there should have been a more determined and coordinated attack on the first day at Shiloh, one that would have completed the rout of the Union Army and driven it, as some have said, to the banks of the Ohio. There was, on the other hand, a decent Union defense line in place. There was difficult terrain to cross for the Confederates in order to reach it. Beauregard saw his own army as disorganized and demoralized by the events of that day. And the debate has long been, would Albert Sidney Johnston have pushed that army that Beauregard did not? We don't know, of course. The arrival of darkness means that the advantage will now go to the Union forces. Lew Wallace will finally find the battlefield of Shiloh, and there will be additional reinforcements from Buell's army, and the key ingredient, perhaps, is the personal resiliency of Grant, who'd already had the experience of arriving on the field at Fort Donelson after Pillow had rolled up so much of his line, had examined the haversacks of Confederate dead to see that they were carrying rations. That is, something that showed him that the Confederate troops were trying to escape, and they were carrying their provisions with them. And this gave him the key information, which led him to close that gap and furthermore counterattack with Smith's men at the other end of the line. Grant was not a man who was easily defeated. The battlefield of Shiloh, the losses of the first day, what had happened to the Union Army, all of this indicated that Grant might well have been in some sort of despair. It was raining, and the houses available at Pittsburgh Landing had been taken over for field hospitals, so that while Grant could sleep indoors that night, he would have to do so in the company of wounded and dying soldiers, and decided instead to sleep out in the rain. It's at this point where Sherman says to him, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" And Grant replied, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow." It's Grant, definitely Grant, and Grant at his very best, not even thinking about the events of Shiloh, not thinking about how his armies, and through his own negligence and through his own fault, have suffered so many losses, so many casualties, have been driven from the best of the defensive positions. Grant is thinking about tomorrow, and tomorrow is a brand new day. During the night, there is an incessant shelling by the Union gunboats, the Lexington and Tyler. The idea in ordering them to shell through the night was to keep the Confederate troops demoralized, as if the Union troops couldn't hear the explosions. It disturbed them. They didn't get a good night's sleep either. Grant had already had the experience of counterattacking, and he was going to do it again. And on the following day, reinforced. Now the odds changed in terms of numbers to the advantage of Grant's forces, and they advance against Confederates who have been expecting that with the dawning of a new day, they would mop up a defeated foe. They weren't prepared for it, and then the United States which is what I'm not supposed to say. Here I am in Mississippi, and we're not supposed to refer to our guys as the United States of America. And I'm trying to break that habit. It is, after all, the U.S. Army that's advancing. Well, at any rate, the Union forces advanced. I guess I'm showing a little prejudice. Well, it's unavoidable. I can't do anything about it. All right. The Union Army advances along the 3-mile front, which probably cost it its chance for any kind of envelopment. And the Confederates began to withdraw about 2 in the afternoon. And when they begin to withdraw in some disorder. And here is another chance for an army to pursue with vigor. That is, to follow up its advantage. But Grant was still under orders from Halleck to avoid this kind of attack until Buell's army was there in its entirety. Grant's army was short of cavalry, and of course the Union Army was exhausted too, just as the Confederates were. It is very difficult on the field of battle to figure out who wins. That is, who wins in a Civil War battle is often a judgment arrived at after the fact. It is difficult for commanders to know when they've won. It's much more easily perceived than if they've lost, and particularly if they've lost dramatically. But any victory is a costly one in terms of human life and in terms of disorganization on the battlefield. And it takes even Grant a while to perceive the magnitude of his victory. There is no doubt that if Grant had pushed on the second day, he could have done even more damage to the Confederates than actually occurred. But there's no diminishing the fact that the Confederates did withdraw all the way to Corinth in some disarray, with considerable loss in morale, with continued mourning over the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, and with a dismal feeling about the future of the South. Now, what does it all add up to? Well, first of all, it adds up to an enormous battle. That is, the casualties on the battlefield of Shiloh are the heaviest of any battle fought in that time in the country. The number of casualties at Shiloh were greater than American losses in all previous wars. U.S. losses are 13,000 plus. Confederate losses are 10,699. The number of actual deaths on the battlefield roughly equal on both sides. And these are still relatively raw armies. It's a battle that is fought largely by men who are under the age of 21. These are, in fact, boys, a phrase that's used frequently during the war. It has a special meaning, and even after the war, the veterans will salute each other as boys when they've long since passed the age at which this is a legitimate phrase. They will still refer to themselves as boys, as they had been at this dramatic moment in their lives. It is a victory for Grant, and yet both Grant and Sherman were vigorously attacked in the press. Grant was accused of drinking at Savannah, and if he hadn't been drinking, at least the question had to be asked, what was he doing in Savannah? Why wasn't he on the field? Why wasn't he at Pittsburgh Landing, where he belonged? The explanation that he was waiting to meet Buell did not go over well, and Sherman was accused of especially unpreparedness and chance to defend themselves. The consequences of the Battle of Shiloh are, I suppose, with some irony, that Halleck eventually soon arrived, to take command of the combined armies. Almost nothing would get this deaf general out from behind a desk, except an overwhelming superiority of forces and an opportunity to take a Confederate stronghold at relatively little cost. By the time Halleck arrived, he was ready to command a combined army of 100,000 men. He had summoned the forces of General John Pope, who had just been successful at Madrid and Island Number 10, to join the armies of both Grant and Buell. And Halleck's advance on Corinth would become legendary for the length of time that it took, for the care with which it was undertaken, for the elaborate entrenchments that were created at every step, for Halleck's misjudgment in allowing the Confederates to evacuate Corinth when it was not necessary to let them go. It was a seriously mismanaged campaign. As for the Battle of Shiloh, the Confederates never really acknowledged that they had been defeated. One of the lessons to be learned from the Battle of Shiloh, at least in the Union Army, was the advantage of the defensive and the position into which the U.S. troops had been driven on the morning of the grand surprise of the first day of Shiloh demonstrated that in this new kind of war with improved weapons, those soldiers who stood on the defensive had a major advantage. So far as the Confederacy is concerned, it is believed that the exposed part of the U.S. forces, that is, the Army under Grant at Pittsburgh Landing, was the last opportunity the Confederates would ever have in the West to attack with a superiority of numbers. The idea of taking that army from Corinth and attacking at Pittsburgh Landing was the best strategy the Confederates could possibly have followed, and of course, as well demonstrated, they came so close. Well, now, I've been told that if I don't talk too long, I can answer some questions. Is that true?
Please do.
That's the king. The king's in the back row. The king has said, I can answer questions.
Professor, from your editorial work with all those papers, to which I admire you, you must have been at the brink of blindness and insanity again, all those volumes. But back east, there was a lot of the bad mistakes by the generals. A lot of the scholars think were encouraged by the fear of that congressional oversight committee that was so meddlesome, following various reverses at Ball's Bluff and other places back east. Were Halleck and Grant and this cast of characters out west aware of that congressional problem, or was this just a personality thing with Halleck and the rest of them?
Well, that's a very good question. The committee was established in December 1861, so it's still relatively new at that time. The committee in its first round of investigations would go into Fremont's conduct in Missouri, and they would take out Western armies as well as the Eastern armies. But there's no doubt that the basic premise behind your question, that a closer attention was directed to any army in the neighborhood of Washington, is absolutely correct. That the committee was set up in response to the demand by certain senators for explanations of that defeat at Ball's Bluff, which is a relatively small affair, October 21st, 1861, in which not only did they demand explanations, but they were looking for an explanation of a peculiar Thunder's Sword. The Battle of Ball's Bluff was lost by General Edward D. Baker, who was a close friend of Lincoln, who was killed on the battlefield. Lincoln had named one of his sons Edward Baker Lincoln, which is something that ought to be remembered, that it was a severe blow to President Lincoln, and this was one time when there would be support from the White House for an investigation of who was responsible for Baker's death. The answer, I think, is very clear, was Baker himself, a gambler, a man without the proper background in military affairs. But Congress fixated on that and eventually persuaded McClellan, who didn't have any moral courage to speak of, to allow Baker's superior, General Stone, to be arrested and actually imprisoned for something like 180 days in New York Harbor. Stone was imprisoned in a place where he later returned and become responsible for building the base for the Statue of Liberty. It's just a neat piece of irony. Stone had no business being imprisoned at that time. Yes, there's an enormous and fearful pressure with a general officer actually being sent to prison as a scapegoat for a defeat. And in the West, officers are much freer to make mistakes, and sometimes very serious mistakes, as Grant made at Shiloh. And later on, Grant would reminisce about the Civil War, and he would say, if General McClellan had come along the way we did, and had not been given so high a command at once, he would have ended up the war at the top with the rest of us. A very generous comment from Grant, I must say. But it's one with which I can agree, that McClellan, being the special subject of attention for the Committee on the Conduct of the War, did not have the opportunity to make mistakes. He knew it all along. He was super cautious. He knew that one of his subordinates was already in prison, and there's probably a cell waiting right next to Stone. Put McClellan in. And if I'd been McClellan, I would have been far more cautious.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. John, could you explain the organizational structure of the departments in the West? I'm still somewhat confused about the interrelationship between Buell and Halleck's department and just that evolutionary structure there. Could you expand on that a little bit?
As soon as Fort Donelson had fallen, Halleck, who was commanding the Department of Missouri, which extended over to the line formed by the Tennessee River, at that point he said, give me command in the West. I ask this in return for Fort Donelson, as if he deserved a lot of credit for Fort Donelson. But that's military stuff. And essentially he was rewarded with authority over Buell, which he had lacked before the fall of Donelson, and was able to coordinate those two armies, as well as the other army. As he continued to command in Missouri, he continued to command on the Mississippi with Pope's force, so that he essentially had these three armies, if you will, Pope's, Grant, and Buell, that could be brought to this side of the Mississippi River, while he was essentially concerned with that defense of Missouri and the West. So he did get an enlarged command as a result, and it was this enlarged command that he wants to throw at Corinth. At the same time, Johnson is in command of the West, which means essentially all the Confederates have beyond what's becoming or will become Lee's command. Yes, sir.
Was it lucky happenstance that the federal armies were named after rivers, which seemed to parallel a lot of the campaigns that Did that help any of the focus, or was that just accident?
Well, it's essentially, I think, more a matter of military tradition and in part accidents. That is, some of these department names existed in the U.S. Before the Civil War, and they're basically continued into the Civil War, and then the Confederates tend to take something that's going to distinguish them. Not that everybody knows the difference between the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of Tennessee. That is a sticky point for everybody, as it well could be and should be. But essentially, as the inheritors of the U.S. military system, these river names become more common in the north, and the state names and other names in the south. It's a kind of happenstance, and yet there's a reason for it. Not a very good reason. After all, at the beginning of the war, it would have been nice that if, at the moment that the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, they had also said, hey, we're going to be gray, you be blue, so we'll know when we fight. That's a matter of evolution. And during the course of that evolution, some serious mistakes take place. Oh, I didn't know they weren't ours. They were blue. That's a remark made at the Battle of Bull Run. They were wearing blue. How dare they wear blue? And there they are. They've just come across and taken a strong position, and still they're Confederates. Whoever told the Confederates, just because you're Confederates doesn't mean you can't wear blue. Gradually, they learn.
Concerning the choice of Pittsburgh Landing, were there no other alternatives? Was Crump's Landing not suitable? Was there nothing on the other side of the river? What led up to that choice? What can you share about
Well, that's a very good question. If Grant had known, if the planning had been superior, yes, the other side of the river looks a lot better then. On the other hand, there aren't that many points where troops can actually be landed and deployed. And the size of Shiloh, which, well, I think most people are aware of already, but it's going to be drummed Indian in the next few days. It's going to see that you really need a large expanse of relatively open and dry land for a sizable army, and you're thinking too, as people were at Pittsburgh landing, about those major creeks that form, as they see, a kind of protection for the flanks of the army. There are relatively few positions that high and that commodious, where there's a river landing, fields adjacent, and other conditions that troops actually need. And and even that is not big enough, or there wouldn't be troops at Crump's Landing, which is part of the problem too.
So he stationed troops at Crump's Landing for lack of space as opposed to protecting that?
I think it has more to do with the matter of space than of the actual terrain. There just didn't seem to be room. Putting troops too close together is conducive to disease and to disorder, and there are constant problems about it. Good camping ground is not well understood during the Civil War, but at least there's a rudimentary sense of it. The idea of open space, decent drinking water, and room to move around.
How do you view the battlefield management, or rather the presence of the federal leadership on the battlefield on the first day? How do they perform once under fire and trying to rally the troops?
That's a good question. If there's a real incompetence in senior command on the field, on the northern side, I don't know who it is. That is, we do see a good response on the part of the Federal Division commanders, all of them. including those from whom not much was expected, such as Earl, who is not one of the major heroes of the Civil War. But what did he do wrong at Shiloh? Well, that's a little hard to figure out. Grant was later reported to have been seen all over the field with all of those commanders, spending less time with Sherman, whom he trusted the most, than with any of the others, and giving them some sort of encouragement as well as some sort of practical instruction as to what they should do. And if there's any failure to carry out those orders, it's not a marked one. That is, we have a pretty good feeling about the commanders on the field, nor do we have any special objection to Wallace once he gets there. Once he recovers from his initial bad response, about which there's a ton of paper and a continuing dispute, and there's still Wallace-ites around, particularly in Indiana. It is a state with an inferiority complex that is earned over the years. And in response, every once in a while somebody will pipe up, "Oh no, Wallace was just going the way he should have been going. He listened to what Grant said and he went off." Well, that's Hoosiers for you.
Let me ask you to comment on the other side of the line about the relationship between Johnston and Beauregard and how that played out as far as the collapse of organization at the end of the first day.
Well, I'd like to say something about it, particularly because Steve's supposed to talk about it, and I'm afraid he'll say the wrong thing. I've never been a great admirer of Albert Sidney Johnston, and what strikes me as salient in this relationship that you're asking about is how much Beauregard seems to take over. That is, how much Johnston seems to defer to Beauregard. Now, Johnston was sent to the West to take care of that important side of the Confederacy by Davis. Davis trusted Johnston. If he's not a general, we don't have one. Beauregard was sent to the West to get rid of him. And he becomes second in command. And what that means is largely in Johnston's hands. During the advance on Corinth, Grant was made second in command to Halleck, which meant that Grant had absolutely nothing to do. That his army was in effect taken away from him, given to George H. Thomas, something that poisoned their relationship for the rest of the war. Grant was in despair because he had been made second in command and effectively shelved by that order of Halleck. On the other hand, Beauregard begins to perk up. He begins to take over and probably does more in the sense of arranging for the Confederate attack than one would expect. What was Albert Sidney Johnston doing? Well, it's hard to figure out. It, I think, has to do with the fact that Johnston had not recovered from the fall of Donelson. His morale is still relatively weak, whereas Beauregard was not involved in this really, and doesn't take responsibility and is ready for a fresh fight. I would say that Johnston behaves more like a general who's been defeated last time out than Beauregard does, so Beauregard becomes more active in planning the campaign.
Explain a little bit about why Grant and Sherman were so trusting of each other, and Grant put so much reliance on Sherman so early in the war.
Among the commanders on the field, Sherman's the one who'd been to West Point, and there is a strong West Point tie. Sherman had been a protege of General Halleck, who was the general commanding Grant as well, and I think that strengthens the tie. Later on, Sherman would say, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by Grant when he was drunk, and now, by God, we stand by each other. Sherman, for once, was joking, but he was taken seriously at that point. And both had reverses from which they had recovered. And I think they were conscious of that shared past that brought them together. They're also, I think, attracted by the fact that they're opposites, that Sherman is volatile, noisy, demonstrative, prone to exaggeration, and Grant is just the reverse of that, understated, but he's much interested in what Sherman has to say. Sherman proposes and Grant disposes very often in the Civil War. They genuinely like each other, and they operate brilliantly together.
Other than Sherman's temperament and general miserable disposition, was there anything that caused him to reject repeated scouting reports from the field? The Confederates were very close at hand and in very large numbers. Why did he think they were all back in Corinth?
It's hard to say. It's very difficult to say. As for his miserable disposition, if he were here, I'd spend all my time with Sherman. Nobody's more delightful. Nobody has more interesting insights into every aspect of the human condition than Sherman. I just love it. Well, I'd like Grant better, but I spend a lot of time with Sherman. It's not a miserable disposition, but it certainly is an element of obstinacy, self-confidence, and the kind of self-confidence that comes from having had a nervous breakdown, perhaps, and shouldn't have existed on the field. There is not only the evidence of actual Confederates nearby, but there is the familiar pattern of small animals crossing into camp that the approach of a large army will bring. And at that stage of the war, a lot of the soldiers are amused. Look at all the bunny rabbits. Well, they should have known. It's an army with banners that's coming. Don't be amused by the squirrels and the bunny rabbits. It is probably one of the most fearsome sights that soldiers can see later on in the war. They know what it means. I don't think they knew at that point just what this business meant. And still, it's hard to explain. Sherman simply thought he was dealing with inferiors, and at that point, military arrogance sets in. You think there are Confederates out there? Well, there aren't any. And after all, I'm the boss. I say so, and that's it. Bad pattern, of course, but it's one that you would expect in a professional dealing with amateur soldiers for the most part. That is, untrained and non-West Point officers. You're panicky, you're overexcited, you're going to lose control of your men, but just calm down, there aren't any Confederates nearby. Which is, of course, the wrong reaction. And it's very hard for people to imagine. That is, Grant's own experience with the Confederates at Fort Donelson led him to think that they would not attack. Not until they were themselves attacked. That is, get that counterattack at Donelson. And perhaps Sherman had absorbed that lesson too. That wrong lesson from Donelson, but I'm not certain.
Other questions? Thanks so much, John.
Thank you.